The good thing about these answers is that they're not exhaustive. So they lead to further questions, and which means that the task of thinking is always ongoing. It's an enduring process. There are no final answers. And I think it's good because otherwise final answers can lead to dogmatism. In the Western countries, the situation has stabilized in the past weeks. But there is a lot of self-interest. Look at the whole vaccine policy. Every day I read newspapers, and it really makes me angry when I read that in North America and the US, they're coming up with campaigns where they're offering people $1 million dollar lotteries to get vaccinated. And in African countries, even frontline workers, primary healthcare workers, doctors have not been vaccinated. So in that sense, on the one hand, we can celebrate the globalization of compassion and the globalization of solidarity and how people are reaching out to each other and how the civil society is playing such an important role. And on the other hand, there are these counterexamples that show that self-interest still plays a very, very important role in geopolitics. Now to come to the So to come to the role of artists, art institutions, aesthetic practices, I think that it's a bit of a double-edged sword. And I'll start with giving you my punchline. So this is, again, something I draw inspiration from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida and the post-colonial feminist scholar Gayatri Spivak, that art institutions, aesthetic practices are like pharmacon. They can be both poison and medicine. In the German context, of course, it's always been a puzzle. How could people who, read Goethe and Schiller and listened to Bach and Beethoven, then work for 8 hours a day in the concentration camps, and in the evening go and listen to music and the sublime music and this wonderful literature. So how could a country that gave us these wonderful thinkers, philosophers, music, literature, also give us fascism? And that's where the ambivalent role of art needs to be taken seriously. I do agree with Adorno that art should not just be purposive, but I disagree with Adorno insofar as I don't think that art can be unrelated. I don't think he would say art is unrelated to ethics and politics, but that art can in a certain way also have certain political goals which can be contingent, which can change in the process, and yet they can well, I don't want to use the word serve, but perhaps push certain agendas in certain directions. And this brings me to now concretely to your question of the role of art in the process of decolonization. And there are two responses to this. So there is the decolonial approach, which has been popularized by colleagues from Latin America like Walter Mignolo, Ramon Grossfugel, and they speak about aesthetic disobedience, which is, of course, a very exciting term. So they talk about how artistic practices, decolonial artistic practices need to, move away from Eurocentrism, this idea of modernity, Eurocentric normative understandings of what qualifies as aesthetic, what qualifies as beautiful, sublime, the European canon, whether we're talking about in the field of music, drama, performance, classical arts, and they speak of a return to pre-colonial forms of aesthetic practices, pre-colonial forms of curating aesthetic performances. And it's, like I said, it's very compelling, it's very exciting, this idea of aesthetic disobedience. And yet, there is a problem with this idea, and here comes in the post-colonial perspective, because the post-colonial scholars, particularly the ones that I draw on, people like Gayatri Spivak, who in her book from 2012, An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization, talks about how the promise of decolonization as an overcoming of Eurocentrism is a necessary but impossible project. Because if you take seriously the impact of colonialism, the legacies of colonialism, how deeply it is part of the post-colonial subject formation, then decolonization as simply undoing everything that accompanies colonialism is a bit misleading. So here, I would go back to Adorno. Adorno, for example, gives the focuses on jazz and talks about jazz. He kind of gives the example of jazz as bad art, because he says it kind of reinforces and reifies black identity politics. It's part of this cultural industry which produces this mass products which can be consumed, and how jazz is also to a certain extent linked to black politics. And this is a negative example of art serving political purposes. And I think Adorno is a bit short-sighted in his critique and condemnation of jazz. And here I would juxtapose Adorno's analysis of jazz with somebody like Angela Davis or Stuart Hall, who talk about the very important role of musical practices, particularly jazz. And Angela Davis focuses on singers like Billie Holiday. And what an important role it was in the subject constitution of black female sexuality and subjectivity. And I think this is something that Adorno kind of missed out on. So Eric Hobsbawm, the brilliant Marxist historian, said of Adorno that some of his Adorno's writings on jazz were some of the stupidest lines he had ever read. And I think that's where great minds can also go wrong. So to come back to your question of can art and artistic practices play a role in process of decolonization? I would say yes, they can play a role. And if the next follow-up question is how can they play a role, there my answer would be, I don't know. I would not be arrogant enough to give a kind of a Dr. Oetker's recipe of how to save the world in 10 steps. I think it's a kind of an open-ended practice. That's there again my concept of pharmacon comes in, poison and medicine. And wrap up. I tend to give long answers. I'll wrap up my response to your question. I love this metaphor of Spivak's that aesthetic practices, political practices, ethical practices are like brushing your teeth. We all got up today in the morning and we brushed our teeth. Brushing your teeth. And it's a kind of a futile exercise because none of us know whether we'll survive the day. Even as I speak to you, could have a heart attack and die in this second. And yet, very religiously, I got up in the morning, brushed my teeth, had lunch, brushed my teeth, and in the night, I'll brush my teeth again in the hope that I'll turn 80 and have good teeth and can still enjoy a baguette. So, dental hygiene is in some ways a critique of mortality. It's a futile exercise, and yet we do it. It's repetitive, and it's working without guarantees. It's an open-ended process, and yet we do it in the hope that something good comes out of it. And I think one could similarly talk about aesthetic, political, and ethical practices. We have to pursue them in the context in which they arise. So aesthetic practices in Berlin will be very different in some ways to aesthetic practices in Senegal, to aesthetic practices, say, in Bangladesh, because they, in a certain way, respond to the context in which they emerge. And so I would be very careful of giving universal kind of one-size-fits-all recipes of how to decolonize. And yet I'm hopeful that art can play a role in the process of decolonization. I'm very fascinated, actually, with the whole idea of silence. The whole time I've been mostly talking about Western philosophy, from Aristotle to Plato to Kant, Schiller, Adorno. And yet, actually, I have a very rigorous training in ancient Indian philosophy. And it's a very key concept in Indian philosophy because, of course, they're fascinated with language and the limits of language. What we can do with sound and what are the limits of sound. And when we talk about the limits of sound, it's not a very simple juxtapositioning of speech and silence. Because if you go back to the concept, the Sanskrit, Buddhist, Vedic concept of shunya, it's quite interesting because it actually comes from mathematics also. It means zero. And of course, zero makes everything possible because you put a zero behind one and then you can have billions. And yet, it's too little. I mean, the translation of zero into or shunya into zero or nothingness is kind of misleading. Emptiness is much more than nothingness. So translations, the limits of translations. I'm going to give you a long answer. Yeah, please bear with me. To come back to the concept of silence and speech, and what has happened in Western philosophy is there's a bit of a foregrounding of speech. So if you look at political philosophy, the speaking subject is always the subject who's considered to have agency. From Plato to Mills to Kant, Kant tells us the definition of Aufklärung is Ausgang aus der selbstverschuldeten Unmündigkeit, exit from self-incurred tutelage. And the whole idea of enlightenment is public spheres where bourgeois men, of course bourgeois men, came together to discuss and deliberate about important political issues. That time about the French Revolution, whether it was justified to use violence for political goals. So to repeat myself, the whole focus was on speaking, the speaking subject. And listening, to a certain extent, was sidelined. So Kant makes a distinction between the public use of reason and the private use of reason. And he says only bourgeois white men are capable of public use of reason, and women should be in the private sphere because they can't exercise reason. And of course, one of the key indicators of exercising reason is speech. You have to be able to speak in a certain manner which is politically efficacious. Only then you become a legitimate political subject, which means those who are silent can't exercise political agency. And here comes one of the most groundbreaking moments of postcolonial studies: can the subaltern speak? So Spivak is basically, she starts the text by critiquing two of the most important post-structuralist thinkers, Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, who claim in a very important Gespräch, in a very important conversation on intellectuals, say that actually the masses can speak for themselves. And intellectuals don't need to speak in the name of the masses. Yeah? So everybody is informed about what kind of situation they find themselves in, and they're able to express. They're able to analyze and express their political predicament. So basically, Deleuze and Foucault are in a certain way announcing the end of Marxist ideology critique. And this is where Spivak intervenes and says, speaking and listening is a very complicated process. It's not just a transparent process of what is happening right now, that I'm speaking and I'm being listened to. Now I come to the heart of your question. So what Spivak is saying is that, of course, there are people, marginalized, disenfranchised, dispossessed people who are speaking, who are constantly speaking, who are talking about their suffering, their disenfranchisement, their marginalization, and yet they are not heard. And that is one of the most important characteristics of being a subaltern. And the moment the subaltern is heard, the subaltern is not subaltern anymore. So she kind of turns the tables on a very Western framing of politics, the politics of speaking and the politics of listening, and shows that when we are talking about ethics in politics, we need another ethics of listening. This is where I kind of worked with Spivak's understanding against the backdrop of my training in Indian philosophy and Western philosophy. That's why the long answer. To come up with these two concepts of hegemonic listening and subversive silences. Because silence is not just a passive act of not speaking, silence can also be subversive, and listening can be very hegemonic. And I can continue with examples, innumerable, inspiring historical and contemporary examples of subversive silences. I mean, and Another very good example is Gandhian anti-colonial struggle. There were certain restrictions put against political gatherings. So what Gandhi would do is call for prayer meetings where people came from far and away, and they would sit together and they would meditate together in silence. Because, of course, if you were to, political slogans against the British Raj were disallowed, and everybody knew that it was a political gathering. And yet there were no political sloganeering that was happening. So there was a very, very, very clever, extremely, cunning in a certain way. Gandhi was a brilliant political strategist and very cunning also political strategy through the subversive use of silence. And to give you more contemporary examples from other parts of the world, this heartbreaking meetings of mothers of those whose children had disappeared during the Argentinian military dictatorship. So on Sundays, these mothers would wear white and gather in the biggest square in Buenos Aires to mourn also in a certain way the disappearance of their children, of their loved ones, which gained a lot of international attention. This is something I learned from a colleague in Iran, where there was a few years back, there were these protests against the regime, and people went on the streets with empty banners. And there were several reasons why the banners didn't have political slogans on them. One, because they knew that if they put political slogans on them, they would get into trouble with the regime. They would get into trouble with the police. So in a certain way, everybody knew that they were protesting, and yet the banners were, so to speak, blank. They were holding the banners up, but there was nothing written on the banners. And another reason that this colleague from Tehran told me was that there were so many different agendas that people who were participating in the demonstration were pursuing that they couldn't reach a consensus. So in a certain way, the blank sheet that they were holding was, so to speak, I'm not going to use the German word, Projektionsfläche. It was like kind of a kind of a possibility for everybody to project their own political agenda on this blank sheet without, being in the face. Another fantastic example of a subversive silence comes from Gezi Park, where this artist would stand there, protest, without saying anything, without, not even neither verbally saying anything nor physically saying anything. And yet everybody knew that it was a performance of protest. So, which is not, don't get me wrong, I'm not again, presenting speech and silence oppositionally, but I'm just saying that silence can be very, very powerful and can be, in a very counterintuitive way, can be very subversive and can be a manifestation, can be an embodiment of political agency. And this goes against this very Eurocentric historical framing of politics only in terms of the speaking subject. I think that when we're talking about the ethics of listening, it's a very difficult exercise. And perhaps slowly to wrap up our wonderful conversation and encounter, let me give you share a story which actually happened with me. And it doesn't come from the aesthetic sphere, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned. So a few years back, a friend of mine called me up. And this friend worked with an NGO in the south of India. And she called me up and she said that, there was this huge initiative. The UN had this Millennial Development Goals for empowering third world women, poor women in the global south. And there was a call for applications from a very reputed, I won't take names, international NGO for empowering third world women. And she wanted to write an application and asked me if I would have a look. And I was like, of course, I'd be happy to help. So she sent me the application, and she was a Delhi-based colleague who was working with another local NGO in the south of India. And so there's this very remote village where caste discrimination was still being practiced. So, of course, the Constitution, according to the Constitution of India, any discrimination on the basis of caste is illegal. Just like racism is illegal in Europe and we still have racism, or sexism is illegal in Europe or Germany, according to the German constitution. But of course, heterosexism, sexism, racism is ubiquitous. So similarly, in this little village, women were not allowed to access water from the village well because they were part of the lower caste. So they would have to walk for 2 hours every day to collect drinkable water. So she spoke to the local NGOs and came up with the idea of applying for funding so that they could build a pump, a water pump to draw groundwater so the women won't have to walk for 2 hours. She sent me the application and I was like, fantastic. And she said, do you think it's a good idea? And I was like, as the Americans say, no brainer. Go for it. A few months later, she wrote back to me, or she called me up and said, you know what happened, Nikita? It failed. And I was like, yeah, why? And she said, yeah, the thing was that we constructed the pump and we did an inauguration and everything went well, and photo op, we even, published a cover story in the local newspaper, all well, lot of backslapping, great job we did to empower poor third world women. And a few months later, we went back to do a follow-up report. The representative of the international NGO came in. And we went there and we met with the local women and found out that these women were still walking every day for 2 hours to collect water. And I was like, oh, I'm sure they must be they're being bullied by the upper caste villagers, which is why poor women have to walk. And she said, no, that was not the case. We went there and we found out, and that was not the case. They were not being bullied. So I said, what happened? And she said, you won't believe it. It took us weeks to find out what happened. So I got very curious. I was like, okay, this is like, my guilty pleasure is I love creamies. I love reading thrillers. So this was almost like a, thriller. I was like, okay, the plot thickens. What happened? And she tells me, we didn't know. We didn't speak the local language. So we had to hire somebody to translate for us. And the women were not willing to talk to us. So we all had to cancel our flights back and spend another couple of weeks in the village figuring out what the hell is going on. And after spending a couple of weeks in the village, talking to these women, building a kind of a trust relationship, one of the younger women, under conditions of anonymity, told us, well, the thing is that, of course, it's extremely inconvenient to walk every day for 2 hours to collect water and it's hot. And yet, these 2 hours is the only social time, free time that we get to spend with each other. So what we've done is convinced our village elders that the water that we source from 1 hour away, 1 hour going, 1 hour coming back, is cleaner. The quality of water is better than the hand pump. So of course, when there's an emergency, we use the hand pump to get the water. But on an everyday basis, we leave our children with our mother-in-laws and father-in-laws and other seniors. And then, we take food with us and we can sing together and we can talk about our problems and our domestic quarrels and, just that's time for us. And me, in my arrogance, time budgeting, efficiency, thought, if I had 2 hours every day more, I would have time for yoga, to meet my friends, read Foucault, Nietzsche, Nagarjuna, Shankara. And this is the arrogance or the failure of the ethics of listening. Our overestimation that we understand the world, that we know what the solutions for the world's problems are, and not that we are part of the problem. And which is why I think that for another politics, we need another ethics of listening.